embassy and interrogated a number of employees who were there. They're still there. And we're talking about 1978 when he went down there, who had been there when Oswald supposedly made a visit. And they told him categorically that they believed that the person who came there and made such a big fuss and was such a nuisance of himself was not Lee Harvey Oswald. They never set foot in the Cuban embassy. And then he also, we went into this this afternoon, I'm not going to go into it in great detail, but he also was told that the tapes of Oswald's voice had been destroyed and not one single one has survived. So it appears that there was an imposter going around with the Cuban and Soviet embassies, laying a trail of evidence and creating an image of Oswald which would be used against him in the impending assassination. This, of course, is this is an horrendous thing. And if anything points to a conspiracy, this situation does. Pursuing his investigation, he questioned David Atlee Phillips, who was, I believe, in charge of the CIA station in Mexico City when Oswald was alleged to have gone there. And he put a set of about 30 questions to him about Oswald's alleged visits, and found that David Atlee Phillips lied on every single question. And then he was informed that a CIA officer by the name of Winston Scott, I'm not sure what his rank was or what his position was, did have a photo of Oswald entering the Cuban consulate, the Cuban embassy, but that he kept it in his safe and never showed it to anybody. And Lopez questioned the people who were running the surveillance cameras, CIA surveillance cameras, and they told him that they believed that that picture showed Oswald in the company of 2 CIA officers. Well, to continue that story, and we went over this a bit this afternoon, Lopez then claimed that Chief of Counterintelligence, CIA Counterintelligence, James Jesus Angleton, came down to Mexico City upon Scott's death, and Mrs. Winston Scott also confirmed this, and he opened up the safe, confiscated the picture, and destroyed it. So if anything is more mysterious and suggestive of conspiracy than that, conspiracy involving the CIA, I don't know what it is. Pursuing further suggestions that the CIA may have been involved in this crime, we have an admission of David Atlee Phillips, who became chief of operations in the Western Hemisphere for the CIA. And he told a friend of mine currently a private investigator in Washington by the name of Kevin Walsh, that it was his, and I'm quoting, it was his private opinion that JFK was done in by a conspiracy, likely including rogue American intelligence people. From someone who was CIA chief of Western Hemisphere operations, that's a pretty big admission. There was a similar admission from another CIA official by the name of James Wilcott, who was a former finance officer at the Tokyo station. And right after the assassination, he claims that word soon spread through the station that the assassination of Kennedy was a CIA-covered operation. This was just sort of brooded about, like a rumor that just flew around the office. And that from his contacts with other CIA personnel in the Tokyo station, he came to the conclusion that the covert operation was kill Kennedy, blame it on Oswald, who was linked to Castro, and this would provide a pretext for another invasion attempt on Cuba. This was more or less the nut of the conspiracy. Well, this scenario was brought to the House Select Committee on Assassinations by Mr. Wilcott, and he wanted to testify before the committee and Instead, they had a minor staff member interview him, and that was that. They ignored him, and nothing ever became of it. But still, it is another significant admission by a high-ranking CIA official that the CIA may have had a hand in this crime. I had an occasion to discuss this with a very wonderful investigative journalist who wrote a seminal book on the Kennedy assassination, Anthony Summers. About a year ago, we discussed all of this. He had just updated his book, Conspiracy, which came out in an edition about a year ago, an updated edition, and I recommend it to you very highly. And he was beginning to center his suspicions if there was a rogue elephant in the CIA, someone who was out of control. In other words, he was not necessarily beholden to his superiors. He could more or less do what he wanted to do. He did what he wanted to do. And Summers, who's investigated this crime, I think, more thoroughly than anybody else, his two candidates for possible CIA rogue elephants are William Harvey, who coordinated the CIA Mafia assassination plots against Fidel Castro, who was a rabid Kennedy hater, and who was extremely independent. For example, he never told his superiors what he was doing. Here he was plotting the assassination of the president of a neighboring state, and he kept it all to himself. He never told the head of he never told his boss. His boss, John McCone, was kept completely in the dark. And so here's a man who sort of fits the bill for someone who is headstrong, independent, has been involved in political assassinations, and hated the Kennedys. And I think a great deal of more research should be done on William Harvey in this connection. And then another man who Tony Summers suspects was a front man for the CIA. He wasn't actually a CIA officer. His name was David Sanchez Morales. He was known as El Indio, and he worked alongside of Harvey in the Castro assassination plots. Was known to be very violent, had ordered and committed himself several murders, and also was extremely independent. And Tony is beginning to conduct an investigation of David Sanchez Morales. So who knows what might become of those investigations. At least we have two people who could conceivably have organized a plot, a CIA plot against the president. Well, we'll pass on to the Mafia involvement. Oh, I neglected to mention that both Harvey and Sanchez were very close to the Mafia. Mafia bosses were very good friends of theirs. For example, both of them were very close to Johnny Rosselli, who was the mob fixer at the time, and was active in the Kennedy assassination plots. Okay, we come to the case of Mafia involvement. Now, I always felt that Jack Ruby's killing of Oswald, the suspected assassin, was the clue as to where the crime came from. It was a beacon, it was a flashing light. Here was a mobster, and he knocked off the suspected assassin, a witness in the crime, and that is the opus, that is the modus operandi, classic modus operandi of the Mafia. We have many examples of it, two which come to mind. There was, in 1956 in New York, the acid blinding of journalist Victor Ricel, and they found out that the Mafia had hired a petty burglar who had nothing to do with organized crime whatsoever. He was hired. They paid him $500, and he threw sulfuric acid in Victor Ricel's eyes and blinded him for life. 3 weeks later, he was murdered himself. Another example was the shooting of Joseph Colombo, head of the Colombo family, before 65,000 people at Columbus Circle in Central Park in 1976. And in that case, the Mafia hired a young black with a very minor criminal record who had no experience with organized crime. He shot Joe Colombo, and 3 minutes later, he was shot dead by one of the Colombo forces, who in turn was never caught. So this kind of thing, Ruby shooting Oswald is something, is what the Mafia does. It's typical, it's not atypical. So let's go on to the connections between Oswald and Marcello and Ruby and Marcello. To reiterate for those of the general public here, Carlos Marcello was at the time the supreme boss of the underworld in Texas and in Louisiana. He was so powerful that he controlled the political machinery of the entire state of Louisiana. And he reigned as a virtual dictator, a very feared man and a very independent man. In the Mafia, if you're going to undertake something very important like assassinate a president of the United States, ordinarily you go to what is known as the commission, the ruling body, the Supreme Court of the Mafia. You've got to get permission from them. Marcello didn't have to get permission from anybody. The New Orleans Mafia, Louisiana Mafia, was the oldest and most entrenched mafia in the United States, and he could do what he liked. So it's not inconceivable that he could have participated in the plan to kill Kennedy. Well, there are lots of strange connections between the principals in this case and Marcello. Oswald's uncle, whose name was Dutz Murrett, worked in Marcello's gambling network, worked there for many years. I found out from an FBI informant who was involved in a sting operation against Marcello in 1979. I guess I can mention his name, was Joseph Hauser. He followed Marcello around for months in 1979 in the process of bagging him for the FBI, and he discussed the assassination with him several times. And he also discussed Lee Harvey Oswald. And Marcello was quite frank about it. He said, "Oh yes, yeah, I know that man Murrett, and that crazy kid Lee Harvey Oswald. Sure, we know who he is. He worked as a runner in the summer for his bookmaking network." So there we have a little connection between Oswald and Marcello. And then, of course, the thing that really sort of makes Marcello very suspicious in this whole scenario is the fact that we now know, and the House Select Committee on Assassinations established it beyond any doubt, that Ruby was also connected to the Marcello organization, and he was one of Marcello's men in Dallas. And he was actually under a man by the name of Nicholas Civillo, who was Marcello's deputy in Dallas. And I talked to a lot of people about this. I talked to people who were on the Chief of the Commission, and they told me Ruby, incidentally, was a gambler. He was involved in narcotics, prostitution, and gambling in Dallas, and he could not have been involved in those activities without the blessing of Carlos Marcello. So Ruby also was connected to Mr. Marcello. All right, let's proceed from there. Of course, you all know that Robert Kennedy initiated the most intensive campaign to destroy the Mafia in the history of the United States. It was unique until him, attorneys general, as they say, more or less maintained a holding action with the Mafia. They never attacked them frontally. Bobby Kennedy committed, he declared war on the Mafia. He was out to destroy them. And they knew it, and they regarded the Kennedys as a dire threat. Now, returning to Marcello, I initiated the Freedom of Information Act petition to obtain the entire FBI Marcello file. And it was a long battle, but we got most of it. Jim Lazar, who is the greatest Freedom of Information Act attorney in the United States, did a fantastic job. Incidentally, recently he's gotten for me all of Marcello tapes. This is a 2-year battle it took to get them. All but 3. It's very interesting. There are 3 tapes in which Carlos Marcello discussed the assassination. And they are sealed, and they could not be released in this big release that we got. We were going to try and go after them too. And to my complete surprise, going through mountains of documents, I found FBI reports of allegations suggesting Marcello involvement in the assassination that were never sent to the House Select Committee on Assassinations. So the last great investigation of this crime never saw these documents. And it came as a great surprise to me. Later I found out that the FBI withheld a lot of material from the House Select Committee on Assassinations. Well, what were these documents? One of them was quite fascinating. Right after the assassination, a man by the name of Eugene de la Parra went to the FBI field office and he said that he was working as a barman in a bar which was owned by an associate of Carlos Marcello. And one day, in the summer of 1963, the owner of this bar announced to everyone who was there, apparently did not know that De La Parra was sort of hiding in the wings. He said, well, the word's out to get the Kennedy family. President Kennedy's going to get shot when he comes south. And Shill De La Parra, they didn't pay too much attention to it at the time, and right after the assassination, he went and reported this. This De La Parra made a similar allegation right after Jim Garrison opened his investigation of the assassination, and he changed it slightly. And I don't think it's very suspicious that he changed it, but it added a new twist to it. He went to the FBI office after Garrison announced the opening of his investigation, and he said that he was in that bar, owned by a Marcello associate, when Marcello's brother, Tony Marcello, came in to service the slot machines. Marcello did a big slot machine business, franchising them and loaning them to bars and restaurants. And Tony Marcello came in and said, the word is out to get the Kennedys. He's going to get it when he comes down here. Well, I don't think you can discount these allegations. The FBI regarded this man, Eugene De La Parra, as a reliable source. They very briefly and superficially investigated the allegation. They weren't able to disprove it, and what they did in the end was to shelve it, to neglect it. And those reports were never turned over to the Warren Commission, incidentally. Then there was this other allegation, which was never brought to the attention of anybody, never brought to the attention of the Warren Commission, never brought to the attention of the House Select Committee. And that was this businessman from Georgia who was doing business in New Orleans in the spring of 1963, was in a restaurant owned by Carlos Marcello, which was part of a compound owned by Marcello, where Marcello had his headquarters, where he actually planned his crimes from. And he claimed that one evening within the restaurant, this man came in and sat down at the table, and a great hulking monster of a man who turned out to be Marcello's lieutenant, who made about 340 pounds, 6'2". You couldn't mistake who he was, came in and had a conversation with this individual and passed him what looked like an envelope stuffed with cash. Right after the assassination, this man went to the FBI office, he was from Georgia, FBI office in Savannah, and told them that he saw Lee Harvey Oswald in this restaurant that belonged to Carlos Marcello, accepting an envelope of cash. They investigated that. They were never able to disprove it, but they did nothing about it. The allegation was shelved, and it was never sent to any of the investigating, to none of the official investigators. Nevertheless, it's just one more little hint that possibly the Marcellos had something to do with this crime. I think now it's wise to consider the actual plots that we know of against the Kennedys on the part of organized crime and unions very much influenced by organized crime. Now we have, first of all, in the summer of 1962, a Teamsters official from Louisiana, Edwin Parton, was present in Jimmy Hoffa's office in Washington when Jimmy Hoffa astonished him by outlining a plot to kill both Kennedy brothers. He went into the plot in some detail, how he was going to carry it out. He thought of bombing Kennedy's house in McLean, Virginia. He thought of blowing up his car. He thought of hiring a gunman with a rifle with a telescopic sight. He discussed it at some length. And this was corroborated by several other people. Hoffa, incidentally, was a close friend of Carlos Marcello. About, let's say, 2 months later, witnesses were present in Marcello's farmhouse on his 4,000-acre estate outside of New Orleans when Marcello swore vengeance against the Kennedys in the presence of Edward Becker, a Las Vegas businessman, and outlined his rather detailed plans on how to neutralize Bobby Kennedy, who was out to deport him, who was out to get rid of him, throw him out of the country. And that was not to kill Bobby Kennedy, because if you kill Bobby Kennedy, the president would probably know where the crime came from, would call out the National Guard, and it would be worse for the Mafia, worse for organized crime than before. And Marcello evidently reasoned, according to Becker, that you had to kill the president, and that would neutralize the Attorney General, Bobby Kennedy. Because, as Marcello told Becker, it was well known that Lyndon Johnson hated Bobby Kennedy, and also J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI, hated him, and so he would have no power whatsoever. And it turned out to be exactly true. When Bobby Kennedy returned to his office as Attorney General after the assassination, he was powerless. He couldn't do anything. Hoover didn't even return his calls. He was utterly without power, and his whole program against organized crime collapsed. I neglected to mention a couple of other things. When I went down to Louisiana to poke around and start investigating Marcello and his family for this book, I was astonished to find a lot of reputable people in law enforcement who knew about other outbursts of Carlos Marcello in which he swore vengeance against the Kennedys. He owned a big hunting camp in Grand Isle, Louisiana, and this friend of mine, was district attorney of St. Landry Parish, was there at a big barbecue. Strangely enough, in that society, law enforcement people and mafia people, they mix in big social events. They had about 200 or 300 people, and Marcello was to invite the district attorney of the parish. You know, he liked to have that district attorney on his side. And somebody mentioned how Bobby Kennedy was harassing him, and it was in the papers every day, talk of deportation. Bobby Kennedy had tried to deport Marcello already once unsuccessfully, and somebody mentioned, "Boy, Carlos, how do you take this? Bobby Kennedy always bugging you and harassing you. Hey, don't worry about Bobby Kennedy. We're going to get him. He bothers us so much. My wife complains about him every day." His wife, incidentally, her name was Jacqueline. And he said, "Jackie is so fed up with that guy, and my daughters are crying all the time. They don't want to lose their daddy, and not going to lose their daddy, because we're going to get that guy, and we're going to get the Kennedys. Don't worry about it." There was this great outburst occurred. And I ran into several other examples of that. Evidently, Marcello was airing his deep feelings of vengeance all over the state during 1961, 62, and 63. All right, now pursuing this trail, we mentioned Hoffa's plans to kill the Kennedys. We mentioned Marcello's announced plans to kill the Kennedys. Shortly after Marcello's outburst at Churchill Farms, it was only 3 weeks later, Jose Alemán, a very well-known Cuban exile, was having a discussion with Santos Traficante, boss of the Florida Underworld in Miami, and they were talking about Kennedy's harassing Jimmy Hoffa. And at a certain point, Traficante said to Jose Alemán, "Mark my word, Jose, this man Kennedy is in trouble. He's not going to make it to the election. He's going to be hit." And he said it in a very forceful way. And Alemán went and reported it to the FBI right afterwards. And the FBI didn't pay too much attention to it at the time, but after the assassination, they went and interrogated Jose Alemán about it. So you have first Hoffa, and you have Marcello, both friends, and then you have Alemán, who was a friend of both Hoffa and Marcello, telling someone that Kennedy is going to be hit. There seems to be something afoot. You can't help but feel that there's some kind of plot involving Hoffa or Marcello or Traficante that is afoot. So let's just consider this trail of purely circumstantial evidence. We have Hoffa telling Edward Parton that he wanted to kill the Kennedys. We have Marcello telling Edward Becker he wanted to kill the Kennedys. We have Traficante telling Alemán that Kennedy's going to be hit. Not long after that, we have the barman, Eugene Della Parra, in this Marcello-controlled bar in New Orleans, hearing the owner of the bar come in and say, "The word is out to get the Kennedys. President Kennedy's going to be hit when he comes out." Shortly after that, you have the episode of Oswald receiving an envelope with Carlos Marcello's headquarters. And then, during the summer, we have evidence of Oswald seeing somebody who was working for Carlos Marcello. And this man, Guy Bannister, was running a detective agency in New Orleans, and his name was David Ferry. Now, David Ferry was seeing Oswald, and he was at the same time he was seeing Marcello regularly every day. Well, not every day, but at least every week. And Oswald at the time was working for Marcello as a runner, a messenger boy, let us say, in his gambling network. And Oswald was also working for Bannister. That's an interesting episode which we might touch on very briefly. It was Anthony Summers who found out that Oswald was an agent for Guy Bannister, and that the demonstrations that he was making in behalf of Fidel Castro in New Orleans, he was making evidently at the behest of Guy Bannister, who was a violently anti-Castro partisan. And it was Bannister's secretary, Delphine Roberts, told Anthony Summers that all those leaflets and placards, pro-Castro placards, were kept up in a room in Bannister's suite of offices. So that was confirms what everybody suspected, that Oswald was not a pro-Castroite. He was seen mostly with anti-Castro people in the summer of 1963, and that his demonstrating for Castro appeared to be creating an image for himself as a pro-Castro supporter. And behind that effort, evidently, was Mr. Guy Bannister. All right, to pursue this assassination scenario, which I repeat is highly circumstantial. On November 16th and 17th, which was the weekend before the assassination, Carlos Marcello and David Ferry met for 2 days in his farmhouse at Churchill Farms. On that particular weekend, Oswald's whereabouts was still unknown to this day. He disappeared, his wife didn't know where he was. Nobody knew where he was. So we have this tantalizing, intriguing situation. We have a man who has sworn vengeance against the Kennedys, who told witnesses that he planned to kill Kennedy, meeting with a very good friend of Lee Harvey Oswald the weekend before the assassination. Read into it what you want. It still remains very highly suspicious. Also, at that time, Oswald's future assassin, Jack Ruby, was stepping up his telephone calls all over the nation to various mafioso figures. He had been calling up various mafia figures all summer, but in October, November, he stepped them up, and it was about double the amount of calls. And on October 30th, Ruby called a Marcello lieutenant by the name of Nofio Petor, an associate of whom had bailed Lee Harvey Oswald out of jail in the summer. So we have a network of multiple associations here, which is extremely suspicious, to put it mildly. What other little scraps of evidence do we have suggesting organized crime's involvement in this assassination? We have a few little bits and pieces revealed in television documentaries marking the 25th anniversary. For example, I think it was in the Jack Anderson show, they interviewed Pat Kirkwood, who was the owner of the Cellar Door nightclub in Fort Worth, where 5 or 6 Secret Servicemen stayed up all night carousing, and they thought that the slowness of their reactions the following day was due in part to this drunken party that was going on in the Cellar Door. Well, that doesn't necessarily link anybody to the mob, but Pat Kirkwood told a national television audience that the girls that he invited to the party, who were enticing the Secret Servicemen to drink, were all strippers from Jack Ruby's club. So if that isn't suspicious, I don't know what is. Another little scrap from one of those television documentaries. I think it was from the British documentary. I'm not absolutely sure, but it was a testimony of a former Dallas policeman by the name of Don Ray Archer, who had custody of Ruby just after he had killed Oswald. And evidently, according to Archer, Ruby was extremely nervous about the situation he was in. He kept asking, "What's happened to Oswald? Is he okay? Did he die?" He was terribly agitated, a nervous wreck. And finally, another cop came in and he said, "Hey, Jack, it's okay. You're gonna get the electric chair. You're gonna die because Oswald's dead, and you've had it." Whereupon a great smile came over Ruby's face, a tremendous sense of relief. And he wasn't nervous anymore. And what we think was behind that, it goes back to the code of the Mafia. If you are told to kill somebody and you botch the job, you yourself get killed. So, I mean, the impetus to carry out a hit contract is pretty strong, because if you don't carry it, if you refuse or if you botch the job, it's the end of you. So he was in a safer position, knowing that Oswald was killed, knowing that Oswald died, than if he had lived. All right, we have these little bits of the puzzle, and it certainly doesn't convict Carlos Marcello, but I don't know of any scenario where you have more bits of information, multiple associations, as strong as these. CIA involvement, you have a few indications, a few hints here and there, but nothing quite like this scenario. I'm not going to go into the conspiracy theories of David Lifton and Mr. Groden, which point toward the complicity of the United States government, even the executive branch of the government, in the assassination. That's pretty much beyond my ken. But there are, sufficing to say that there are people working very hard at this angle too. And, well, enough of that. Okay. What can we say? What was the motive of the CIA to get involved in a plot to assassinate Kennedy? The motive seems to be, they said they felt a sense of betrayal that John Kennedy had betrayed them by depriving the Bay of Pigs invasion of air support. And of course, we know a lot of Cuban exiles died, and the plans of the CIA to regain Cuba were dashed, and they felt that Kennedy had betrayed them. And their motive for getting rid of Kennedy was to get him out of the picture so that they could proceed with their plans. But I don't necessarily go along with that, because did Lyndon Johnson turn out to be any more favorable to the CIA's plans to invade Cuba and get Cuba back? No, he wasn't. They might have fooled themselves to think that by killing Kennedy and blaming it on a pro-Castro supporter, Oswald, that this would fire up the country so much that there would be calls for an invasion, and quite possibly they would be able to proceed with their plan. But that seems to be a little far-fetched too. The motive of the Mafia I consider much stronger. The motive of the Mafia was simply self-preservation. It was a response of having been threatened with destruction, with extinction. Everybody knew that Bobby Kennedy was out to destroy organized crime. He announced that. It was clear. So I think between those two motives, the motive of organized crime had to be the stronger one. Now, what many of us have begun to think is that there are many indications that if there was such a plot, it probably was a combined effort of the CIA, the Mafia, and the Cuban exiles, because they were all in the same bed together. At that time, the CIA and the Mafia were in alliance, and they were both in alliance with the Cuban exiles, and they were both anxious to get Cuba back, all three of them. The Mafia wanted its casinos back, and the Cuban exiles logically wanted to get back to their homeland. So the most likely scenario, it would seem, would be a plot involving all three groups, CIA, the Mafia, and the Cuban exiles. And that's one of the reasons why people like Tony Summers have come to be extremely suspicious of William Harvey and David Morales, because they were very close to the Cuban exiles, they were very close to the Mafia, and they were people who went their own way and could have concocted their own plots independent of the direction of the CIA. Well, there are a lot of people who are working very hard on this case. With almost 30 years of ceaseless investigation of this crime. Many of them are here tonight, and in fact, they're all heroes because nobody makes much money out of this sort of thing. It's a lot of very tough, hard work, and often you are neglected by the establishment, or you're scorned by the establishment. You're not going to get ringing praise from the New York Times for your discoveries. So I want to assure the public who's here tonight that this band of third-decade researchers, that they're all a bunch of heroes in their own right. But alas, I've begun to worry. I think all our efforts are destined to be totally eclipsed or overshadowed by Hollywood's version of the assassination. I'm referring to Oliver Stone's upcoming film on the assassination, provisionally entitled JFK, starring Kevin Costner as Big Jim Garrison. And we have learned that this $40 million assassination extravaganza may be a work of fiction, with little or no resemblance to historical truth. The Kennedy assassination researcher Paul Hoke has called it dances with facts. And George Lardner Jr. of the Washington Post has called it Dallas in Wonderland. Anyway, Oliver Stone is spending $40 million on his assassination film, and that is more than what the FBI, the Warren Commission, District Attorney Garrison, the Church Committee, the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and all the independent private investigations combined have spent during the past 27 years. And all I can say is, think what you and I could have done with that 40 million. That's it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Davis, for that very engrossing discussion. We're going to open this for questions and comments. I know we all would like to question or maybe challenge Mr. Davis on particular points of fact or interpretation. I know that I have published a fairly extended review of Mafia Kingfish in the third decade, which was mostly favorable but also critical on a number of points. I'm going to give a paper to the convention tomorrow that's going to take off from Mr. Davis's CIA or Mafia or both, and I'm going to call my scenario the CIA, the Mafia, and more, because I think that there are other forces that belong in this. Of course, he included the CIA, or the anti-Castro-Cuban activity. But I'm going to refrain from my own tendency to dialogue with Mr. Davis on this point, and I'm going to give preference in recognizing people to the members of the public who are not part of the convention, since this is going to be their sort of only chance to probably question Mr. Davis. We are, by the way, going to have a reception for Mr. Davis immediately following in the hallway, for which everyone is cordially invited to stay and meet him, and if you are lucky enough to get his ear for a moment to talk with him. But I am going to recognize first people, and that's why I'm here, because I kind of know who's the convention and who isn't. Anyone not one of our third decaders that wants to raise a question at this point? Yes.
Jack Ruby, even when he was near death and would apparently have nothing to lose at that point, reveal nothing of his activity in this?
Well, Jack Ruby made one outburst on the steps of the courthouse, I think in his second trial, which was recorded, where he yelled out at the journalist something like, "You can't imagine how big this conspiracy is." Remember that? It was recorded, and he ran it on about that people at the very highest levels were involved. He may have been just slightly hysterical at that point, but he did make some sort of a confession like that. Yes.
By the way, that's a little bit of tape. It's in a video called "The Plot to Kill Kennedy." I think it's called. I bought it. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, narrated by Anthony Summers.
Yeah, he said a complete conspiracy.
Right, that's right.
Through all the facts,
Yeah.
you'd be amazed.
That's right. Perfect. Yeah, we're perfect.
That was another different one. Yeah, he kind of babbled there.
Yeah.
He actually held, I believe, a very brief press conference that might not be fact. I might be incorrect on that, but his statement was to the effect that the public would never know why he did what he was forced to do, because the conspiracy reached, because the people who had put him in the situation he was in had too much to lose to ever let the truth come out.
Okay.
And then he was asked, "Do you mean people high up in the government?" At which point he looked down and said, "Yes." That's it. Okay. High offices in the
But I don't think he said anything in the step that. But he did make that. Yes.
What is the motivation after, well, nearly 30 years, for these tapes that you requested under the Freedom of Information Act, and you mentioned there was a couple of tapes that weren't released. What are the motivations behind the people who perhaps didn't release these or censor these? Or didn't
Well, it
release them?
baffles me. The FBI fights for every single document, tape. They put up a battle. It costs them a tremendous amount of money. It's costing the taxpayers money. It took me a year and a half to get the FBI Marcello file. I'll tell you, a year and a half of constant prodding. It took 2 years to get the Marcello tapes, and I still don't have them. We just won the case in court. And they're supposed to deliver the actual tapes sooner or later, but it'll probably take several months.
You figure after
The
30
three
years...
tapes that were sealed, in which Marcello talked of the assassination, were sealed because at his trial, they tried to introduce, the prosecution had tried to introduce those tapes and evidence, but since they had nothing to do with the particular case for which he was being tried, the violent case, the judge ordered them sealed. And they're not even up at the FBI. They're down in a courthouse in New Orleans, Louisiana, and you have to initiate a whole new legal process to get them unsealed.
I think this question is why would the FBI cover up a mafia conspiracy? What would be their motivation? And one explanation is that J. Edgar Hoover did not admit that such a thing as the mafia, quote unquote, existed.
Oh, exactly. Major Hoover, for a long time, didn't even admit that the mafia organized crime existed. Then, after the assassination, it's now a known fact that any scrap of evidence suggesting the complicity of the mafia in the assassination was withheld from the Warren Commission. They simply did not receive the information. Hoover did not send it over to them.
According to Nelson, these tapes are not 30 years old. They're about 10 years old. They come out.
Yeah, these come out of the Bryland case in 79. The trials were held in 1980, 1981. Yes.
Yeah, really appreciate you coming to this conference and love your books.
Well, I enjoyed it. Let's continue.
In my paper today, which we didn't quite complete, but Mr. Giesbrecht in Winnipeg, many of you might not know about him, but in any event, there was reference made to a hotel called the Townhouse Motor Hotel, and somehow the FBI seemed to think it was in Kansas City when it was in fact in Wichita, which I've been able to confirm. I accidentally came across an article, a cover article on General Walker in Newsweek in 1961, in which he referred to staying at the Townhouse Motor Hotel whenever he was in Dallas, before he presumably bought a house there.
Oh, really?
Do you know if the Townhouse Motor Hotel was a
No,
chain?
I don't, but there was a hotel in Houston that was owned by Carlos Marcello called the Alamo Motel. And that is where David Ferry and his friends spent the night right after the assassination.
Mary Carroll Club is the Townhouse Motor Hotel in Dallas. It was on Harry Pines
Boulevard. It was a very seedy, rough part of town.
Did you think it belonged to Marcello?
I better not, I'd have to look at her letter, but she certainly described it as quite a very seedy area, and a lot of right-wing people used to stay there. She says she remembered that Ward Bond, the actor, actually lived there, and he died there, apparently.
Oh, really?
Now, I'm just wondering if the townhouse in Wichita and the townhouse in Dallas are connected at all, and if there was a chain, and maybe the mafia owned that.
I really don't know, but Marcello's influence extended to Kansas, I know that. And also Mississippi. Yes.
I wanted to
George Michael.
Thank you. I want to reinforce the argument, not necessarily because I believe it, the CIA argument. I can tell you something about the argument. First of all, he swore a blood oath in public after imbibing a little too much, as he was fond of doing, at a retirement party for a Central Intelligence Agency. So that moved all through the non-monolithic CIA and finally out, sufficiently far out, so that people were embarrassed at the vehemence of the gun-toting Harvey. Harvey, in fact, would come into a bar very often. He'd already been drinking, and he'd take out his gun, 45 or Magnum, and he'd put it right there in the drink with the gun on the table. He was a gun-toting, violent, sometimes maniacal man. And he wasn't as independent as I think some of the researchers would like him to be, so he had only a Rogel. He worked for the Office of security throughout assassination operations.
But he withheld his participation in those plots from the higher ups.
From Robert Kennedy, and from the president, in terms of the absence of evidence that he knew.
Well, he never even told his own boss, John
Nor
McCone.
did he tell McCone.
Someone there in the back.
Yes, but
Why do you even mention about them paying $500 to some unknown to throw acid at his face when Ruby was so well connected to the mafia just by telephone calls? You know that had nothing to do with what you said about. You said about the mafia would pay somebody $500 off the street to throw acid in one guy's face.
Oh, yeah, well,
Why would you even mention that? You wasted a lot of time saying that when Ruby's connected. There's no doubt about it.
We're talking about an episode that happened in New York, and I was just using that as an example of how the mafia operates. They would hire somebody who was not in their organization. Marcello, incidentally, when he was plotting against Kennedy, told Edward Becker that he would hire somebody, not to do the job, someone who could not be identified with him. And that's why Oswald more or less fits the bill for that role. The mafia often hires somebody, has nothing to do with them. They don't even know who they're hired by. An intermediary is taking care of it.
Following up on your comment there, I think maybe you could ask, for example, about the credibility of this Oswald appearance at what was the Town and Country Motel, the Marcello headquarters in New Orleans, where at best there was only a very short time frame within which Oswald could have left Dallas and gone to New Orleans back to Dallas. Why would he have to do that? Why would he have to go to New Orleans to pick up money?
Well, we're not saying that was necessarily a payment in regard to plotting the assassination. Who knows what it just establishes another contact between Lee Harvey Oswald and the Marcello organization. I studied that allegation very carefully, and I have about 30 or 40 pages of FBI documents on it. And what made me believe in the allegation of that informant, SVT1, was that he did not know he was in Marcello's headquarters. He did not know who the man was who handed the envelope to Lee Harvey Oswald. He had no idea whatsoever. He just thought he was an ordinary New Orleans restaurant. So it wasn't that he was out to pin this thing on Marcello. And he was utterly convinced. The FBI showed him pictures of Lee Harvey Oswald. He said, yes, that was the man who was there. But the FBI let down on that investigation because this particular informant was with a whole bunch of people that evening. And they could have called in the people he was with and asked them if they saw this episode with Lee Harvey Oswald coming in. They never did. They never questioned the other ones. Yes?
Mr. Davis, the Organized Crime Task Force, as you know, was expanded about 3-4 years ago on a federal level and left up to the states. So it's still very active, even after President Kennedy was assassinated, even after Bobby Kennedy resigned and ran for Senator in New York State. Now, when you were bringing out those things that McCarthy was bringing out in New Orleans, these open statements prior to the assassination, Bobby Kennedy's Organized Crime Task Force, which he attended weekly meetings and very intensified involvement, was there anything in your research to find from Bobby Kennedy's office, either before the assassination or after, that there was talk or material? I mean, Bobby Kennedy wasn't stupid to know that when he was going after these people, especially deporting them to New Orleans and things like that there wasn't going to be people after him, things like that.
Well, he was suspicious that Marcello might have had something to do with it, and he asked one of his investigators, my name was Sheridan, to look into it. And I don't know what he ever came. It came to naught. No one knows what that is.
Always stronger.
Yes.
Was there ever any connection established between the death of Dorothy Kilgallen and other people in the press and the interview that she was supposed to have had with Jack Ruby?
Oh, that was a very mysterious thing, and I don't think it's ever been resolved. Dorothy Kilgallen, noted New York columnist, was supposed to be the only journalist to have been granted an interview, a one-on-one interview with Jack Ruby, and she was about to go out and interview him, and she died mysteriously in her apartment in New York. Was it alleged to be a suicide? An overdose. Yeah. No, that's never been resolved. Way back.
Your view on the mafia is one that I have difficulty in believing, and I'd just like to make a couple of quick points as to why I feel that way. You say the mafia motive, they foresaw that with the death of President Kennedy, that Robert Kennedy's power would be taken away. Now that happened, but I don't see how they could have foreseen that it would happen.
Well,
For example, in 1964, Robert Kennedy could have run for president.
They were very astute. They knew the situation Kennedy was in. They knew the mind of J. Edgar Hoover. You know, those mobsters, they studied J. Edgar Hoover like a book. They knew the mind of Lyndon Johnson, and they knew that with Johnson hating him and Hoover hating him, he didn't stand a chance to get anything done in the Justice Department.
But he could have run for president from 64.
I got it.
But they couldn't have foreseen that he wouldn't.
That's exactly what he said. He said, you don't chop off the tail, you hit the head. The mafia figure said that.
I don't think Lyndon Johnson would have given him the slightest opportunity to run for the presidency and run against him for the nomination.
So they said that was part of the motive.
Yeah.
That's on tape.
He didn't even have a chance to run for vice president under Johnson, because there's no way Johnson was going to pick Robert Kennedy for vice president. And he made damn sure he picked Hubert Humphrey.
He could have broken with Johnson and run against him.
Oh, not in the same party. Must be kidding.
Yeah,
But only because McCarthy.
Oh,
not in 64.
Johnson for the presidency. It would have been politically a very difficult thing to do. And I think he did the right thing politically, which was run for the Senate in New York, and he won the election.
Okay, a couple of other quick points. In your book, you say that Oswald was a runner, and you said this evening, he worked as a runner for Marcella. Now, if it were true, as you say, that Oswald was set up to take the rap, why would Marcella set up somebody who could be traced back to him as a patsy? One other quick point.
That's a very good point.
One other quick
But
point.
it's not that we know that he was acting, it was an occasional job, apparently, carrying messages back and forth between his uncle and various bookies and bettors and gamblers. It was not a very high visibility job in the Marcello organization.
He could have been shot down.
It probably could have been tracked down. That's quite true.
One other point.
It wasn't contemporary with Perry working for Bannister and North.
Well, Hauser was led to believe that he had done it before as a teenager, but also he did it a little bit in the summer of '63.
Jack Ruby, as you say, made a number of telephone calls, a very large number of telephone calls, a suspiciously large number of telephone calls to various mafia leaders and high people. Right. Now, if the mafia were planning to pull off and the assassination was being planned during the time that Ruby was making those calls, we can be pretty sure about that. But if the mafia were doing the planning, they would surely not have allowed Ruby to make all those calls to them during that period.
Well, we don't know what he was actually doing with those calls. It seems unlikely that Ruby and his mafia friends would be planning the assassination of the president over the telephone. That seems to be rather unlikely. But at least they were made aware of Jack Ruby's presence, and so that when that moment came to get rid of Oswald, they knew who was there in Dallas who could do it.
Young lady over here.
Oh, yes.
You said before that not a lot of information or the findings were sent to the committee. When you finally got your files, how complete were they? Or were there key bits of information that weren't there?
I don't believe I got the entire file on Carlos Marcello. I showed it to some experts, and I corresponded with some people who are knowledgeable of the situation. I think that I got a partial file. But what amazed me, what really astounded me, was when I checked with people who were on the House Select Committee on Assassinations, including the Chief Counsel, Robert Blakey, and he said, my God, we never done anything like that. And it turned out, it has turned out, I think we can say it authoritatively that the FBI, which was supposed to turn over its entire file on the assassination of the House Select Committee on Assassination, did not turn over the entire file. Still, much of the file was never turned over. And as for the CIA file, we all know that not even a quarter of the file was turned over.
What are the details behind Bobby Kennedy arranging for the kidnapping of Marcello?
Well, you know, that was an arguably illegal act of Robert Kennedy. And it was Bobby's way of confronting the mafia. You know, he said, if we don't attack organized criminals with methods and techniques equivalent to theirs, they will destroy us. So he was not one to abide by legalistic niceties, go through a long deportation wrangle in the courts. No. A deportation order had been issued by the INS, and Bobby decided to implement it his way, which was to have Marcello virtually kidnapped off the streets of New Orleans, thrown into a government plane, flown down to Guatemala, where he was dumped unceremoniously. Marcello complained that he didn't have a chance to call his wife or pack a toothbrush, that he couldn't cash a check. That's the way this was the way Bobby was going to go after the mafia. The only attorney general who ever behaved that way in history of the United States. And it may have boomeranged on him terribly because Marcello had an absolutely horrendous time down there. Guatemala deported him to El Salvador. El Salvador deported him to Honduras. And for 17 days he trekked through a jungle and fell down and broke 3 ribs, and you know, it was just an unbelievable thing. And when he got back, you know, he swore his vengeance against the Kennedys. But that was Bobby's way of going after them.
Did David Perry bring him back?
No, he didn't bring him back. The House Select Committee on Assassinations did find out from a wiretap how Carlos Marcello got back. And listen to this one. He got back on a Dominican Air Force jet. How he pulled that one off. Leave that up to your imagination. Yes.
I have 2 points. In an article by Scott, Peter Dale Scott, he mentions that the Kennedys only went after the mafia figures that supported Nixon, and Marcello and Hoffa donated a lot of money to the Nixon.
My God, that's a very good point. I never thought of it. Marcello was a heavy donor to Nixon's campaign.
All right. Another point is, in several books I saw this Hoffa County statement and this Marcello statement. Now, do you know any other instance in the history of the mafia where they would tell an outsider of a future mafia head?
Yeah, well, actually, Edward Becker, who was there with a cousin of Marcello by the name of Ropolo, was considered an insider. He was very well connected to the mob in Las Vegas. Ed Becker was once the publicity director of a major casino in Las Vegas. He knew Johnny Rosselli very, very well. He was very, very close to the mob, but he wasn't in the mob. And he had credentials. He was able. Well, he told me that he talked to Marcello for hours and hours before they went out to the farm, sharing the people that they both mutually knew. And he intimated to me that Marcello even called up somebody in Las Vegas to find out whether this guy Becker was okay. So I think that takes care of that question. I think he trusted him because he was close to them. Incidentally, I want to recommend to you a very fascinating book that is about to come out. I've become quite good friends with Ed Becker, and he wrote a book in collaboration with a man by the name of Charles Rappelet called All American Mafioso, the story of Johnny Rosselli. And it is absolutely fascinating. It has a lot of new information on the Kennedy assassination. It has lots of information on the CIA mafia plots from the mouth of Johnny Rosselli, because Ed Becker talked to Rosselli for hours and hours about the plots. It'll probably come out in September, and I recommend it very highly. It's very well written, and it's very well footnoted, documented, and it's a first-class piece of work.
Charles Drago's arms.
Just an alternative idea and then a specific question. Rather than seeing elements of the government, intelligence, whatever, and the mob in an allegiance in an alliance. I see them in a more potential adversary relationship. I throw this up. Imagine the potential for blackmail on an extraordinary scale if the mob knows that elements of the United States government, whatever part of it, were involved with them in an effort, a successful effort.
Well, that's very true.
And vice versa.
And a lot of people have been deeply shocked by the CIA's alliance with organized crime to do away with Castro because they put virtually the entire United States under a blackmail situation. And we're very shocked by Jack Kennedy have anything to do with, let's say, the mistress of Sam John Connor, who was involved in the plots. Because that made him open to staggering, potentially catastrophic blackmail. The Kennedys, of course, they lived on the edge of disaster. They were courting disaster every minute during their administration. The Camelot image of the White House as a locus of light and love and blessedness, the Camelot thing is, it's ridiculous. They were living on the edge of disaster, constantly involved in plots against Castro, plots against mafia bosses. They were always intriguing and taking just staggering risks.
And a specific question that I want to follow up with.
So they were adversarial in that sense. That they were in a situation where the mafia had them by the what's.
Have you heard anything about a supposed telegram or wire received by Ruby on sometime on the 23rd? Reading, and I'm paraphrasing. 23rd of November, the day after the assassination. To the effect, don't deliver the package today, it would embarrass Chicago.
Don't deliver what?
Don't deliver the package today, it would embarrass Chicago. I have a faint recollection of
I heard that someplace, but I really don't. But you know, George?
Right.
So we can trust that remark then?
Well, you can trust the man who published.
I would say that, yeah.
But I would suggest that I think he suggests it's suggestive, and he lets it up, he leaves it up to you.
It wasn't just want to follow but the Kennedys possibly just going after the mafia dons and whatnot. They were just mixing support. The only thing is though, they went after Sam Giancana too, and he was supposed to be involved in the Cook County, Illinois boat fraud that supposedly controversially won.
Yeah, that's quite true, but the two people that Bobby Kennedy went after tooth and nail were both supporters of Nixon, Jimmy Hoffa, and Carlos myself. No doubt about that. The two prime targets. Yes.
It seems I recall several years ago seeing a television documentary that showed film clip of J. Edgar Hoover meeting in Central Park with Johnny Rosella. Can anyone shed any light on that? Maybe
I think you're referring to Frank Costello. And there's now no doubt whatsoever that J. Edgar Hoover had a special relationship with Frank Costello, who was the most powerful racketeer in New York, as you know, and also a friend of Carlos Marcello, and he introduced slot machines into Louisiana. I was convinced of this through an interview with William Huntley, who was now an attorney in Washington, who had been head of the Bobby Kennedy organized crime rackets section of the Justice Department. And, excuse me, Huntley was once staying in the apartment of Edward Bennett Williams in New York. And he got up in the morning and went to have breakfast, and who was sitting there at the breakfast nook in the kitchen but Frank Costello. And they got talking. And Huntley said, we've heard rumors that you know the boss now, you know J. Edgar Hoover. So J. Edgar and I, we go back years. I give him the betting piece. He's better and better at the racetrack. And I give him the tips, and he makes the money, and he comes back for more. Evidently, there was J. Edgar Hoover loved to go to the track and place bets, and he got inside information from Frank Costello, and he cleaned up every time he went to the tracks. And that was the basis of that friendship. Who knows whether it went further than that. It certainly was very compromising. Yeah.
You mentioned gentleman from Fort Worth who entertained the Secret Service men the night before the assassination, and you mentioned, of course, correctly, his association with Jack Ruby. You neglected, or maybe you weren't aware, and I'm surprised you didn't mention it anyway, given your thesis. Pat Kirkwood was very much crime connected in, say, Texas. This comes out, for example, in Jim Marr's Crossfire.
Oh, yes. No, I'm aware of that.
W.C. Kirkwood, his father, was quite a big man in Texas crime.
Oh, I'm aware of that, but I think we only learned for the first time from that television documentary that the girls who came in and supplied the Secret Service agents with liquor were Jack Ruby's strippers. Jack Ruby sent him over there for that purpose.
And these Secret Service agents, in their own statements, they quite categorically deny that they caroused, that they, a number of them mentioned they drank an unidentified thing that's called a salty dog, which would be grapefruit juice and salt, or something to that effect. At least the agents themselves were denying that they were drunk, and that the drunkenness may have been the least important aspect.
Yeah, well, you know, that episode was actually written up by the Warren Commission, also by the House Select Committee. They were fully aware of it. Yes, way back then.
I was wondering if you know if Frank Bender is still alive, and if so, if he still chain smokes Camel cigarettes.
The first one, Frank Bender, rings a bell in my head. I'm not sure he's
Not his real name.
Which name do you want to use?
Yeah, I know this.
Felix Dretcher, who was in charge of the invasion of Cuba, the Cuban exiles.
He was Hunt's boss, right?
Yeah. He was fourth in line in the CIA.
Frank Bender, something about
Frank Bender, yeah. And who swore to kill Kennedy.
He was no longer assistant? No, I don't know anything about it.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, with Frank Bender's chain smoking question, I think maybe we're ready to adjourn, have some refreshment in the hall, and have a chance to meet.
And now a word from our alternate sponsor.
This really is. Think all the names and the faces you've seen and did it quite well. Yes. He deserves an award for this, you know?
Drew, we have everybody have this on all these videos.
Yeah. Well, it's better than thinking, you know, I talked to date somebody, you know.
Is anybody here going to use this on? Although the interest is really one, well, maybe two. What's everybody? Here's back in 77. Did you ever see that Dallas Hurricane video?
Yeah. No, unfortunately, the conference wasn't very good.
All right, will we please come to order for the third session of the third decade of Search Council. For those who are just coming in, copies of Charles Drago's paper and my paper to be given this morning are over here by Fred Devine in the middle. And also,
Could I have one
the
of Jerry's, please?
yellow piece of paper is based on, it's a list of conference participants, hopefully 99% accurate, based on the sheet that I passed around yesterday. I know that there are a few people whose names that I know are not on there, and I don't know whether they had gone to the bathroom when the paper
circulated, or whether they didn't want their name listed or whatever. But anyway, I apologize if your name isn't there and you were in the bathroom or whatever. John's name is not there.
It's not there.
No, for one. But anyway, that's as complete a list as I could come up with of people's names and addresses, and those people that wrote phone numbers, I wrote phone numbers. Marty?
Is there anybody else that wants to be on the list, or is there anyone on the board?
Okay. Okay, does anybody want to volunteer to do, would you like to volunteer to do that? Yeah, all right, anybody that wants to be on the list, write your name on the board. Marty's out there. And while we're doing that, about papers, there are 3 papers I'm sorry I'm not going to have available for distribution because I just haven't had the time and haven't had really any clerical help this weekend to be able to duplicate 3 of the papers. Joel Wagner's that we're going to hear this morning, and Gary Rolls that we heard yesterday, and also Vince Palomera's Secret Service paper. What I will do on those papers, I think that's kind of one of your entitlements as a conference registrant. I will send those papers to you. Those of you who are 3rd decade subscribers, I'll stick them in with the July issue, which hopefully about 2 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks, that'll be out. And if not, if you're not a subscriber, I'll send that to the address that you left on the directory. So that's what I can do, I guess. We are going to have a change of program here, at least a change of order of program. Charles Drago has an early flight and he's going to have to leave by 10:30 or 11. And John Davis also has an early flight, and so we're going to hear Charles Drago's paper and discussion first, and we're going to kiss John and Charles goodbye and go on with the rest of it. Any business kinds of things that anybody wants to bring up while we're still basically all here? I know that people will have to be leaving in moments, so be sure you check out your room key if you're staying. Thank you.
Yes, before those people meet, and I know it's not part of the agenda right now, probably towards the 4th decade, is this going to become maybe like some kind of annual program or something that might?
Well, that's on the agenda for what's next. What next? I have some ideas. I know other people have expressed some ideas about future conferences of this sort. I don't have any agenda of expectation of repeating it next year or any other year necessarily. But I have some ideas, and others already have ideas. So all I can say now is that I don't know if this will be done again or not. It'd be a damn shame if it isn't done somewhere, somehow. Peter?
When I made contact with James Hosty, he sent me a brochure. I think I might have sent you a copy. And not that he has the inside track on anything, but he does do presentations, although he charges. But if we ever had another conference, he would be an interesting person to have as a guest speaker, but he does charge. I don't know how much, but he lives in Kansas City. But yeah, by the way, it is pronounced Hosty. I used to call it Hosty. And he's for anyone who doesn't know, he's the agent that supervised the Oswalds when they first came to Dallas.
Well, I invited him to this conference. He turned it down, and so did David Bell, and I had to go to John Davis.
Oh, you did?
No, I'm kidding. Oh, and 6 other people.
You're no David Cullen.
Thank you, Peter. Yes. You said you wanted to ask about a videotape you're looking for?
Yeah, one called the CIA Secret Army, CBS documentary back in '77, and the other was Dallas Motorcade. If anybody's got any information on them, I'd appreciate it very much.
Okay. Do you have a shooter or two? All right, drop right on.
I'm not sure it's going to do you any good to follow this word for word because I am conscious of time. I'm going to leave some things out, but you'll have it to read. I'll direct your attention back to it at one point that I think is critical. And I think that the time slot allotted to me couldn't be better because what I really want to address is not any new scholarship. I'm not out to answer questions. I'm out to ask them. And I really want to address our motives, what we want to see as the end result of what we're all gathered here to talk about and do. I want to talk about some of the frustration that I have felt, and I dare say that some or most of you have felt as we've gone through this thing over the years. And as I prepared this paper, I thought of 3 lines from a poet named Richmond Lattimore who said, "We sang as best we could for the sake of those who are gone, and it does no good." I believe that justice upon too infrequent occasion is the function of revelation, the good done by truth. It should be the response to the call of history, the second half of the work song begun by so many of you here today and by so many absent friends. But I have to wonder if can the best and the brightest of us, historians and scientists, jurists and journalists, regardless of what we do, singing as best we can we realistically hope to do good? Especially in a time when the background noises of jingoism and self-aggrandizement deafen so many of us to the peculiar frequencies of the truth we seek. Then again, does it really matter for whom we sing as long as we sing for ourselves? To paraphrase the jazz critic, the observer of that other uniquely American form of self-expression, is it enough to blow miles or must someone out there really dig? I want to know, how will we know when our work is done? What will be enough to satisfy us? Let's indulge ourselves with the fantasy for a minute. Plotters and gunmen are identified, officially. The deceivers are dethroned. History isn't rewritten, but rather it's revealed for the first time. As is, and here I understand we may part company, as is that great American peep show in reverse, the voting booth, where the citizen voyeur pays his money only to become unknowingly not the buyer but the bought. Not the watcher, but the watched. What happens after all the press conferences, after Warren's 26 volumes and the apologies of Bellin and Priscilla McMillan and Latimer are shifted from the history sections to the fiction shelves? What happens after all the I told you so's are told and told again? We will have sung out the truth. But what then of the good? What form can justice possibly take, especially in light of the fact that the men and women who bear direct criminal responsibility for this act day after day themselves are being shotgunned or tumored or macheted or stroked into eternity? What if justice can be effective? What if, for instance, the truth, as we attempt to reveal it, somehow could empower Americans to undertake the social and political revolutions necessary to strip authority from the killer's heirs? What if? What if the consequences of Dealey Plaza, which I perceive to be conflict and impoverishment and death on a global scale, and as the disenfranchisement of every subsequent domestic generation, what if these consequences could be appreciated as such, which would be the ineluctable first step in the process to ensure that they don't occur again? What if? What if Clint Hill had reacted 3 seconds sooner? What if Greer had reacted at all? I'm pessimistic. I submit that in order for justice to follow as a consequence of what we're doing, the truth, as you continue to reveal it, must be turned out not only in your appropriately disciplined, professional, sober styles, but also in the gay and brutal raiment of art. For as society's collective response to certain recent political acts of violence makes all too apparent to me, the truth, absent its intensely emotional presentation, has the half-life of a Hong Kong suit. Let me give you some cases in point. Almost before the ink in the Swiss bank books had a chance to dry, we were implored to put behind us Watergate, Irangate, Contragate, the October surprise.
All of these, in relation to the Kennedy assassination, relatively contemporary nocturnal emissions of the American dream. This from the same leaders who, in the same breath, encourage our selective memories to store the fornicates and stupor-gates of their political enemies. So is it sane, let alone realistic, to expect the smoking guns of Dealey Plaza revealed to provoke any official response beyond a presidential call for amnesia, or any public reaction rather than an involuntary twitching of the channel change finger? Art is the last champion of justice. Specifically, and for America in the late 20th century, I refer to literary and cinematic art, novels and movies. To my mind, they alone seem capable of penetrating what I call the clogged cultural arteries of our gerontocracy. They alone have the last best chance to reach and reinvigorate so many emptied hearts. But there are problems with art in history. Gore Vidal warned that historical fiction is neither history nor fiction. And I take that warning to heart as I begin my own labor of writing a novel about the Kennedy assassination. I seek your advice, and in a very real way, your consent, because unlike so many other historical events and characters that continue to inspire artists, I realize that the drama and the dramatis personae of this story remain at the core of what amounts to a very valuable crusade in progress. A crusade in progress, one that owes its longevity and its robustness directly to the kind of intense labor and personal sacrifice that we've all witnessed here and talked about this weekend. And when I think of the contributions made and the costs incurred by Sylvia Marr and Harold Weisberg and Mary Farrell and Penn Jones and so many more, I really have no choice but to honor their standards of personal and professional integrity by attempting in my own work to meet those standards. But I'm going to make up a lot of it. And that's the problem. Will a work of fiction in which important historical incidents and personages are to one degree or another inaccurately rendered, and in which occurrences and players of key significance to the story are made up, can this help us or will it hurt us as we struggle to tell the truth and effect justice? By definition, good art will stimulate the kind of emotional response that I think is the necessary complement to what we're all doing. But the virtues that qualify a work of fiction as good often are difficult, if not impossible, to reconcile with the standards of the historian, the standards of the researchers that you all know so well. I've been admonished by Harold Weisberg, which doesn't exactly put me in an exclusive club. He warned me to, quote, be completely and resolutely responsible and not in any way mislead the people, end quote. He went on to say that he has, quote, pretty much kept up with the overt fiction and the pretended nonfiction that is fiction about the assassination, and he can't think of any, regardless of medium, that did not mislead and misinform. Some examples.
Groucho would say I resembles that remark.
I resemble that remark. I'll give you some examples. Most of us recall the novel and subsequent film Executive Action, Mark Lane, Donald Freed. In my mind, that work committed almost every imaginable sin a piece of fiction can commit, including the most heinous one of all, boring. One critic said, after the fact, he said, quote, Executive Action promised to clear the air about the JFK assassination, but was more successful at clearing theaters, end quote. But give credit where it's due. Despite tortured prose and structure of the novel and the turgid direction and overacting of the film, Executive Action managed to point the finger at a very early point in directions to which many of us look today. The best part of the novel, I thought, was Richard Popkins' introduction. He addresses the potential value of such a work. He says, quote, the Warren Commission report presents part of American mythology. The novel of fact presents another possible reality, a political conspiracy that could account for what happened and make it a meaningful event and indicate who was in command in the United States, end quote. Problem is that given this fiction's gross failures of technique and absence of inspiration, there was just no chance for Popkins' best case scenario to come about. On the other hand, consider a novel that came out at roughly the same time, a little later, called The Tears of Autumn, which I thought was one of the best titles. I wish I had it. And it's an assassination set piece by a novelist named Charles McCary. Now, his premise, unlike that of Lane and Freed, is from an historical standpoint absurd. He has the Diem family in South Vietnam taking its revenge on the Kennedy brothers for their supposed complicity in the murders in South Vietnam. We could call this Howard Hunt Strikes Again. Now, McCarry's a first-rate novelist, and his prose is intelligent and it's vital, but as a clarification or a revelation of the record, it's lacking. And it may be argued that what he's done is hurting rather than helping what we're doing. I'll express my point in a rhetorical question to Harold Weisberg and to all of you. Which is preferable? Which will help us more? A poorly realized work of fiction telling good history, or a beautifully written novel with facts and figures bearing not the slightest relationship to the truth? And I think the answer is it's a hybrid. I accept Harold's admonition, and I understand Gore Vidal's warning that historical fiction is neither history nor fiction. Each of those speak to the duality of my purpose as a novelist and as someone who's interested in seeing this case solved. So in the effort to create that hybrid and to do well by you all, I'm going to share very brief segments of my work in progress, which I'd like you to think about, not for any literary criticism, although God knows I can stand it, but really measure it by what you think, if anything, if any impact at all, will it have a positive or negative impact on what you all are doing. And of all the things that informed me as I sat down to write this, I could think of a quote from Picasso at the end of his life who said, "The truth is a lie." So I introduce to you the work in progress that I call The Last Amendment. It's a deathbed confession of an American agent, a fictional character whom I call Victor Gladio. He's a resourceful and experienced agent, and he is recruited, seduced by the conspirators at some of their highest levels to run the nuts and bolts of this operation, to take care of
Kennedy?
I'm talking about pardon me? John Kennedy. He's recruited to run this thing and really to be the contact with Oswald. Most of my story is told in the third person past tense. However, at the beginning and at the end and at certain important moments in the novel's exposition, Gladio speaks in the present tense directly to the reader, and he does so in the structure and form of the screenplay. And I choose this because it reflects the manner in which I believe that most Americans receive their information today on the video screen. If you're not following along, I just refer you to page 5 so that you can visualize how this is set up. You know, I'm not De Niro, so I'm going to read this through quickly, and I just want to give you a sense of how fictionalized this character is and how potentially dangerous this kind of fabrication can be to what you're doing. Begin with the black screen, and on screen there's a quote from an E.E. Cummings poem. It says, "A wind has blown the rain away and blown the sky away and all the leaves away and the trees stand. I think I too have known autumn too long." Fade to black, Victor Gladio. "I've known this autumn too long, and you know nothing of it. The season of endings and beginnings, of the gay and brutal colors of change." Fade slowly to red. "Light is fleeting. Now you must discover your history, and I must answer for my own. You must read the story of your lives in its first edition, and I must give birth to one last legend, for me. I alone am left to tell this tale, and like any teller of tales worthy of so honorable a profession, I'm duty-bound to leave it to you, gentle reader, to divine the greater meaning of my work." We fade in, still in red tones, to historic footage of the motorcade and the sound of the wind and to distorted crowd noises. Gladio. "Ah, but parades are now blood, and blood now parades. But I leap ahead of myself, and since I am celebrated for my patience, I must allow our twisted story sufficient time to unwind, our red and frothing story, as I wrote it, without immodest claims to classic form or character, although truth be told, and if you would assume the position, I could make good use of your voices as chorus, your voices as they were then, so full of good cheer, so hoarse from the swearing of fidelities. Dissolve to real tones, music up. Composition is Washington's Birthday by Charles Ives. Gladio, voiceover. I seek not to share in your guilt. Know that you cheered because you were cheerful. That you believed because always it's easier, safer to follow than to lead. And followers are faithful to leaders, and leaders are beautiful and prideful and sometimes foolish and brave. And all they ever really ask is for us to believe them. Believe me. Cut to a restored, enhanced version of the Zapruder film, panning from the presidential flag on the limousine to a rotoscope close-up of the occupants of the rear seat, slow motion. Gladio. Believe me, my story is ghost-written, but yours, I wrote your story, in my own hand, carved it with a bone chisel, deep into walls you know, into hearts and minds you cannot even imagine. And laws, I wrote laws to die for. This is rich. Think of me as the last framer of the last amendment, who now submits the bill for the Bill of Rights. You'll note the last rounds are for me. And payment is past due, and only just, and I shall compel your interest. The Zapruder film comes to a halt at the last frame in which the president is visible before disappearing behind the Stemmons freeway sign. Gladio, your precious truth is a lie. The truth is my punishment. I damn you for your belief. But I am one shameless son of a bitch, and now I ask you to believe again. Get used to this sort of thing. It enriches our story throughout. Our story. Allow me to begin, but not where a good storyteller would. The Zapruder film begins in slow motion as the limousine disappears behind and then emerges from the sign. It freezes at 3 seconds real time before the final headshots. Gladio. We cannot escape history. Abe Lincoln. Who did not? So we must answer to it. We discover it, bear witness to it in all its pageantry and color. This history I wrote for you, and then I took it from you, and I filled your cavernous emptiness with shit and viscera, the sweetbreads of the body politic. Come closer. Feel the wet heat of my revelation. 'Tis autumn. The leaves are blown away. The air is sweet with the mist of corruption. Closer. Alert your senses. Tighten your sphincters. History begins with an ending. The Zapruder film resumes at full speed as the head of the president filling the screen explodes. Fade to red tones, to black and titles. Know that the Last Amendment is as much about betrayal, personal, cultural, and political, the moral validity of patriotism, love, friendship, art and inspiration in America in the early 60s as it is about the assassination. And yes, I might have chosen any number of historical settings as the mere backdrop for musings upon all of these matters, except the era-specific. Yet, no less than anyone here, I think, I'm drawn to the events of November 22nd, 1963, not simply by their mythic contours or their shimmering ambiguities, or by the accident of a birth date that allowed me to live through them. I need to know this truth. Victor Gladio and his cohorts will reveal as much of it as I'm currently able to perceive and will offer my speculations on the rest. And if I'm correct in my assessments of the power of art and of Americans' collective crises of intellect and ethics and politics, and if I do my job well, then perhaps good old Victor can reveal more of the story than even he thinks he knows. While Victor Gladio is fashioned out of whole cloth, many of my characters are drawn from the record. Chief among them, as you might expect, is Lee Harvey Oswald, whose relationship with Gladio is based upon the conspirators' need to manipulate this first-round draft pick patsy through a series of incriminating pre-assassination events. In my story, it's Gladio with whom Oswald travels to Mexico City. It's Gladio who runs, along with Bannister, Oswald's Fair Play for Cuba Committee false postures. It's Gladio who assigns Oswald the task of purchasing mail-order firearms. Ostensibly, Oswald believes to aid the investigators from the Dodd Committee of the time looking into the availability of those weapons. Now, given the mysteries that make up Oswald's life story, I accept that any artistic rendering of this character runs the risk of distorting history. Thanks to Weisberg's Oswald in New Orleans and Phil Melanson's Spy Saga and so much other important Oswald-related scholarship, we know more than we were ever supposed to know about the man, but there's still so much to learn. So the liberties I take with the character of Oswald may end up troubling you and perhaps performing a disservice to our ongoing efforts, but is there any other way to tell this story as fiction? The relationship between Oswald and Gladio is central to my story, both the literal meaning of it and the symbolic subtext of it. So is the strange bond between Oswald and David Ferry. Yes, the bewigged bishop of the bayou swaggers through the Last Amendment. How could so naturally novelistic a character be left out? He really is embodiment of the old saw. If he didn't exist, we'd have to invent him. But it's Gladio who is at the hub of the wheel of so many important relationships, complex conspiratorial relationships, and personal ones. For instance, the enlistment of unwitting assistance from the press is handled by Gladio's somewhat reluctant recruitment of his old comrade and former lover, a fictional character I call Penelope Weaver. She's a resourceful and professionally competent woman, and she'll figure prominently in the unfolding of my story. She's also based on two well-known journalists of the period whose own publishings and utterances over the years reveal a subtext that isn't exactly innocent. The glue holding Gladio and all of the conspirators together is in the person of a CIA legend, a fictional character I call Harvey King. He's the original recruiter of Gladio, the seducer of Gladio. He's the hands-on representative of the power group that has ordered the assassination. As for the factions that make up that group, they're stereotypically represented by characters which I hope are artistically and historically valid. I'm going to skip ahead. And I'm going to ask you to allow me to make brief mention of two scenes from the Last Amendment. One of them gives an insight into just how, upon occasion, art can mirror unexpectedly the truth. From Gladio's opening screenplay dialogue, which I read, we move back in time to the Bay of Pigs invasion, where we encounter Gladio on the beach as he makes contact with what will be a doomed agent. I won't get into the key plot elements, but I bring to your attention this scene in order to illustrate the following. 2 months ago, I forwarded a preliminary description of the last amendment to Weisberg, who offered this tidbit, quote, "You have one U.S. agent on Cuban soil during the invasion. Did you know that despite the prohibition on this, there was one who did land and did escape," unquote. I didn't know that. The other scene takes place in Mexico City, where Gladio and Oswald have traveled in order for Oswald to go about his Soviet and Cuban embassies business. We talked about this a little bit yesterday. And the problem that I looked at was why have an imposter when you've got the real guy? Well, I think the real guy there going through his paces. So I fill in the blanks. And these are important blanks in the time frame of what we're looking at. I fill in the blanks of the stay in the Mexican capital, and at the same time I identify, I throw this in, the mystery man of the CIA surveillance photos. It's Victor Gladio, who's been forced into playing the role of Oswald. He's playing the role of Oswald due to Oswald's emotional incapacitation. What happens to Lee and to Gladio to force this change in plans is wholly my creation. It involves brutal, surrealistic violence and graphically portrayed sexual activity, which in turn served the artistic purpose of standing for the venal, amoral behavior engaged in by politicians and their intelligence operatives of the time, and stands for the manner in which powerful men yet use the human resources at their disposal. In other words, acts which serve as reflections of the moral character of the countries responsible for them. Does there exist the slightest reason to believe that events such as those which I have created and to which I allude actually took place? No. But they work for the story, and I believe that they'll do more good than any harm, and so they stay in. You may wish to disagree. One more example of going out on a limb for the sake of the story and for the truth. For the ostensible reason of getting to the bottom of the leaks that threaten to destroy the conspiracy from within, and there is that threat, Gladio delivers an ultimatum to Harvey King. I'm going to quote from a 90-page plus preparation, a treatment that I did for this. It should be thought of the way that an artist prepares a sketch before he actually does the painting. Gladio wants to get higher up into this thing for his own reasons. And he says to Harvey King, he says, "This thing of ours, it's too far gone. Oswald's playing games. We don't know what kind, but I don't think we really need to know. We're going through hell for this, and I got to tell you, Harvey, I'm not seeing the why. The more I think about it, the sense we are not making, especially in light of the fact that you could probably kill the man in his sleep, or put poison lipstick on his wife, or make him pop an embolism while he's shitting out a Chateaubriand. All things being equal, we get everything we're looking for. But things ain't equal, my friend. They're pretty odd." Now, Gladio's backing King into a corner. He's giving him only one way to keep Gladio in this thing, and King does it. He brings Gladio face to face with one of the real prime movers of this. And it takes place in a Georgetown townhouse, and I'll skip down, and Gladio encounters this fellow. He's standing in deep shadow, so that his face is hidden. It's a dark figure of a man. Gladio doesn't even bother to make what would have been a futile, fatal effort to catch sight of the man. When the man addresses his audience, Gladio was not the least bit startled by a voice rendered raspy, distorted by a CIA-developed electronic disguise. "I understand your concerns, Victor," says the man. "Listen to me carefully. You're in the process of engineering a public execution of the President of the United States, which is precisely what is required. Fidel must be the false sponsor of this act. He'll be publicly identified, thanks to your Herculean efforts, as the prime mover, but there's another equally desirable consequence of all this. It will occur not only in full public view, but also before the eyes of the President's entourage. In both groups, you could find more than a handful of men who someday, some sooner than others, will strive to attain the White House. To those men, we will deliver a most powerful message, a lesson, one that shall be indelible, I think. Toward this end, the act must be as brutal as it will be efficient. The death you bring about will be traumatic, disfiguring, and you will have put at risk your victim's wife and, if it can be arranged, his children." Which made me think of a few lines from Auden, who wrote, "I and the public know what all school children learn. Those to whom evil is done do evil in return." As I began to formulate the last amendment, I considered and finally rejected a not unworthy stylistic option, namely the creation of a totally fictitious series of events and characters, detailing a political assassination similar to, but structurally independent of, the Kennedy murder. Think of Richard Condon's novel, later made into one black comedy of a movie called Winter Kills, and the recently released film The Package. Relative artistic merits aside, both works scrupulously avoid incidental relationships to the events in Dallas. They're by definition structurally and thematically self-contained, able to stand on their own merits even before audiences who might be wholly ignorant of the Kennedy assassination. Of course, a thinking viewer is left to his or her own parallels and is rewarded for the effort. I realized early on that this indirect approach not only has been done and done well, but the subtlety of the connections drawn by these approaches, the connections between a fictionalized assassination and the death of John Kennedy, that subtlety is inappropriate and ineffective in my judgment, at least today. As an artist and as a conscious human, I simply do not believe that a contemporary audience is sufficiently informed or sophisticated to make the kinds of leaps of imagination necessary for this approach to pay the kinds of dividends I want it to pay. Another rejected plot scenario centered on a counter-conspiracy organized by unnamed heirs, family political, of the murdered president, who tracked down the conspirators and in so doing revealed the story of Dallas in all of its pre- and post-shooting details. And I did so like the notion of doing evil in return. I mean like as in appropriate for artistic potentials. The only trouble is I like the idea of looking at the conspiracy from the inside out, so to speak, even more. But I do reserve for Victor Gladio the perverse luxury of vengeance, upon whom I'm not now prepared to say. Let me conclude by restating in one sentence the premise of this paper. In order for justice to follow as the natural consequence of the revelation of the truth we seek, that truth must be communicated not only in the language of the historian, but also simultaneously with the unique power to move that is the province of art. I ask myself, how can I, a novelist, bring home to my readers the full pathos, the human dimension of the assassination story? I'm ravaged by the notion that at the moment of his death, John Fitzgerald Kennedy knew exactly what was happening to him. Witness on the Zapruder film the movement of his head just before the limousine disappears behind the Stemmons freeway sign. A voluntary, wary response to a first missed shot. What were the neurophysiological effects of a low back wound? Did they preclude that facile mind from grasping what had occurred, what was to come? In those interminable seconds between the penultimate and final volleys, when we must believe there would have been more than enough time for the dying man to experience a full life review, did the president consciously struggle to lower himself out of harm's way only to realize in frustration and terror that his fate was in the reflexes of his would-be killers and would-be protectors? And did the face of a man in a light-colored windbreaker, his right fist raised defiantly into the warm November afternoon, register as a final image, stir a last recollection behind the soon-to-be shattered eyes? These are the questions that will haunt Victor Gladio, my character, for decades, to his own deathbed. This is the horror that will fuel his final nightmare, again from the treatment of the Last Amendment. Audio up to the sounds of an amusement park in full operation, Steadicam at a child's height, moving to a warning sign posted at a mechanical ride. It admonishes, you must be this tall to drive. Pan back to reveal sign draped around wood cutout of Lee Harvey Oswald, full figure in the infamous backyard pose with rifle, pistol, and leaflets. Pan to the ride, comprised of a dozen miniature Lincoln limousines. Children enter and exit cars which move along steel tracks past a mock-up of the Texas School Book Depository. Children sit in front seats, mechanical figures of President and First Lady wave from rear seat. As cars pass the building, mechanical figure of Oswald emerges from sixth floor window. So does a rifle barrel. Smoky blank rounds are discharged, at which point the heads of the figures on the president snap forward on spring hinges. Children scream in delight. Zoom to the building window. The figure of Oswald is gone. In its place is the real Victor Gladio.
Brilliant.
I simply want to conclude these final remarks with praise for Jerry and for all of us who made the trek here. I think this is an absolutely essential kind of event for us. And I want to say that of all the important things that were said here this weekend, the loudest, most contentious parts, I submit to you, were the best parts of all, because it got the juices flowing. These things can bog down. I'm worried about the lack of emotionalism among all of us. I'm worried that we're so far wrapped up in technique that we're losing sight of the human dimension of this thing. We're losing sight about what it means. I'm worried about the next generation of people who are interested in this, whose interest is probably, in my view, stimulated as much by the sense of mystery, of historical mystery, than it is about what it means to us all, not as Americans, but as human beings, what it means for future generations that are going to be susceptible to the same kinds of power plays, the same kinds of unscrupulous characters, unless what we find will somehow begin the process of changing it all. So let's get emotional. Let's not be afraid. As long as the emotionalism doesn't pollute the clear thought, let's rant and rave too. It's good for us. Thank you.
Here, here.